Really insidious thing about violent extremist ideology. You are attracted to this because you're hurting. You're attracted to this ideology, and the ideology tells you you're a warrior for your people, whoever your people are.
The problem with suicidal thoughts is how intense they are. It feels like they will never end. And when you're in that, you have this kind of tunnel vision. It feels like it's going to last forever.
Majority of people look at a homeless person. They're a drug addict. They made bad choices. If homelessness was a punishment for bad choices, we'd all be homeless.
The women that are struggling, that gives the blowjob at $5, this for me is pure 100% exploitation.
I stabbed my wife 3 times one night because she wouldn't let me finish my bottle of vodka. Still not thinking I had a drink problem.
Ultimately, 1 in 2 Americans will experience family estrangement. So that's 50% of the population.
To be completely honest with you, I am a refugee, but I'm not just a refugee.
Because I am George, I'm not George with Down syndrome or Down George, because that's not me.
Welcome to Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This season will inspire you to empathize with people who are regularly marginalized and misunderstood. You won't want to miss a single episode, so hit the subscribe button now. Thanks for watching and enjoy the show.
I sit with so many estranged parents in my therapy practice now, and lots of different families that have fallen apart. And the one thing that I think I could absolutely say that all of them share is that they didn't listen to their children. They didn't take the time or take them seriously when they did take the time. So if you can seriously listen to someone's complaint, really find the kernel of truth in it and know that it's true for them, I think that's where you can actually do really valid work in terms of creating emotional intimacy. As parents, what we want to say is that you're having a great time. I'm doing a great job. Like you're lucky. You've got a roof over your head. You've got food on the table. You've got all these aspects of family capital, which are really important. However, if you don't have that emotional connection, that emotional intimacy, trust that you can bring anything to that parent and it will be okay, then, how can you show love? How can you build on that?
Well, welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Becca Bland, an author, journalist, researcher, and advocate whose work has helped millions of people around the world feel less alone, heal, and move forward from the pain of estrangement. As a young journalist, Becca shared her own family experience in The Guardian, shedding light on a topic often shrouded in shame and silence. That pivotal piece and many others led her to found Stand Alone, the world's first and only nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting those estranged from their families. During her time at Stand Alone, Becca spearheaded groundbreaking research that highlighted the profound impact of family estrangement and the ways in which social policies often assume one can rely on family support. Her work has given voice to millions who have felt isolated, creating a global movement toward greater understanding and acceptance. This season, I'm shining a spotlight on people who often feel marginalized or misunderstood, and through each conversation, my goal is to better understand different lived experiences in order to widen our circle of empathy. Given the work she's been doing for more than a decade, I've invited Becca to discuss family estrangement, and I want to welcome her to the show.
Hello, what an absolutely lovely introduction. I feel very proud of myself now. Thank you.
As you should. And I want to offer another round of gratitude. Becca was kind enough. We were supposed to meet a whole hour earlier, but I got the time wrong, and she made herself available for this conversation nonetheless. So thank you again.
No problem.
Now, I know you don't go too deeply into your own personal story too much anymore. You've done that through a lot of your public speaking in the past, but I wonder if maybe you could just share at a high level sort of what brought you to this moment and the work that you feel so passionate about.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in an immensely difficult family situation. I was also very blessed in many ways. I think that I had like a really amazing grandmother that pretty much did all the raising and basically, yeah, was a real rock and an anchor for me. But then I also had two parents that had really big struggles and really big struggles with family life, parenting, and yeah, so ultimately, I struggled with my relationship with them, and I think they struggled with their relationship with having a child. And ultimately, I think that led me to understand that as I entered my early 20s, that kind of any kind of relationship with them that was healthy wasn't really available. And I made lots of attempts to try and reform things, like through my grandmother, through a counselor, writing letters. But unfortunately, it just didn't kind of bring them to the table and give them the necessary impetus to, I suppose, work on the relationship and change some things. So I guess in some ways they couldn't find empathy for me and my position. And yeah, I mean, I understand that families are complex and they had their own story. So I'm not there to judge them necessarily, but I think I'm here to say that it wasn't that possible to have a relationship that was healthy with them. And in some ways, it was quite dangerous. So when I was 25, I decided that ultimately I would stop trying to make it better and go off and live my life, really. And I think through that process, then I began to understand what it's like to move through life without like a family relationship that was really important. Like there is a lot of assumptions that your parents will be there for you, that they love you, that they are close to you, that they support you. And I think I had that life experience where that just wasn't the case. So I did a lot of my own growing up, really. I brought myself up a lot in my early 20s and had, yeah, a lot of really amazing people around me that helped heal me from the trauma that I was experiencing because of that. And as I say, I had a wonderful grandmother that mitigated a lot of that. But I think that it brought me to this feeling that maybe we needed to talk about this more because what I went through was such a closed process. You couldn't really share it with anybody, and people rarely showed understanding or showed any sense of warmth or empathy towards you, like when you said that you didn't have that parental relationship. And quite the opposite, I often felt judged. I often felt shamed, and I often felt that people thought I must have done something to create that.
Mm. And I reread this morning that poignant piece in The Guardian from 2012, and I'll include it in the show notes because I think it really, I can understand why there was so much resonance in the readership because people could see themselves in your story. And then you were called to start this organization. So I know that you've moved on from the organization, and I do want to talk about that too. But your personal website actually caught my attention. So I'm going to read something from it, and then invite a question and answer. It says the stigma that exists around not having contact with a key family member can make us retreat into silence and inauthenticity. So often the media portray that family estrangement is a flippant response to like this one-off argument, yet these are decisions which are sad and painful and labored over and are caused by things like abuse and alcoholism, mental health struggles, divorce, remarriage, forced marriage, LGBTQ+, and trans rejection. So I wonder, why do people react with judgment when we talk about broken family relationships? What's going on there?
Yeah, I kind of feel in some ways it touches a quite primal fear that we have that we can't abandon the group, that the group is our safety. And we've often had that since tribal times as humans, that in order to thrive in the world, we've needed to survive in groups and communities. And to an extent, I think that's true. But our families are our first group. They're our first social interaction. And to say that we don't have a relationship with them can be quite confronting for other people. And I feel looking at the research as well raises a lot of very instinctual fears that their family relationship could end that way, or that that their family relationship isn't necessarily as strong as perhaps they're making out. And it can feel very unsafe. I think ultimately it can feel very unsafe to be so deeply vulnerable with people. and to say, well, yes, look, I empathize, like I understand my family situation is like that too, then that takes a lot of skill in oneself to be able to bring that up and do that safely, and to kind of protect yourself whilst disclosing something like that. So perhaps the easier way is to just kind of look back in silence or frown, or kind of make, I suppose, an in the moment judgment that, oh, that's happening to them, that's not happening to me. And somehow I'm better and they are, flawed or abnormal. Whereas, really confounding research to that abnormality piece is that ultimately 1 in 2 Americans will experience family estrangement. So that's 50% of the population. So, we're far from alone in having this experience of family life. And yet there's something in us that, because we feel it's abnormal, we don't talk about it.
Mm. And that's why you founded Standalone, right? Which offers support groups, therapeutic workshops, and does a lot of research. So I actually wouldn't mind kind of going into three avenues about the work that Standalone does. So first would be, what does the general public misunderstand about estrangement? That would be something I'm curious about. What is some of the research that you've done revealed? And then what do you think policymakers need to better understand?
Yeah, so I feel ultimately that Standalone really showed was that everybody feels alone. Like everybody feels that they're experiencing this in a silo, in an isolated way. And certainly when I founded the nonprofit, nobody was speaking about this. We didn't have that like dialogue internationally or nationally in the UK to be able to kind of talk about the fact that families don't often function as we might expect. So I think, when I first founded the organization, I was given like lots of correspondence that came to me from The Guardian about what I'd written. And I was young, I was like 27, 28. So it was, as a young journalist, it was actually like really, quite a moment to kind of see how much my writing had touched people. Like I really didn't expect it, and in a way I was very like driven towards like, oh, I'm having my first article in The Guardian. That's what I thought, I was very career minded. And then I figured out actually that what I'd written really touched people and really, really created something in them that helped them to feel less alone. So it made me understand that the simple act of talking about things, sharing your truth, being authentic, and actually saying what's in your heart actually can change lives and actually can help people to feel so much less isolated on this planet, because it shows that there's an experience that's like theirs, that they're not, as I said before, abnormal. And it's an empathy point, isn't it? It's like saying, oh, this person can empathize with me because they've been through it. And so often our empathy is built through understanding experiences of our own and then applying them to other people's situations. So when we see somebody's been divorced, right, we're kind of like, oh, well, I might know what divorce feels like because I've had a breakup, or I've had a really, difficult kind of moment in my marriage, and I didn't think we were going to get through it. So they have that point of experience and they're able to say, yes, I understand that life experience and I can understand the feelings. I can be there with you in those feelings because they're known to me. Whereas I think so few people actually understand, that haven't been through it, what that would be like to not have parents in your life, to not have family members in your life. Like some people just really lack that point of personal experience to be able to give them empathy. And maybe they're not so motivated to developing it either. And so I kind of feel that ultimately what anybody could do by sharing their story, by sharing their truth, by being on podcasts, by like creating blogs, is it just shows that this happens and it shows the feelings. And I'm very grateful in my life that I was given the gift to be able to feel my feelings and articulate them in the way that I can. And, if I'm going to use that gift for something, I'm really glad that I've used it to break down this point where there's so much tension and contraction around this topic of family life not being perfect.
And then what about the research that the organization has done? What are some of the revelations that you've had as you've dug into sort of the quantitative, qualitative research?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting, isn't it? Because like that, what I've just said is something that's very personal, very anecdotal. And the research was really important, really, to kind of say, look, this is, we need to put into fact knowledge into the world that this happens. And what we can absolutely say is that people who are estranged from their families are quite disadvantaged in social ways, emotional ways, financial ways, and material ways. So, what I suppose, characterized it as or conceptualized it as in research is that people lack family capital. And that is that capital that we can draw on from family that, gives us solidity and grounding in the world. And in many places is assumed in policies and in life. The research was very, very clear that professionals, helping professionals, even therapists, counselors, doctors, nurses, very empathic people, we're trained in empathy when we become therapists. We're trained to come down to someone's level and understand where they're at. Even those helping professionals were not, in a way, helping people to feel more normal, because their responses, their lack of training, their lack of understanding of the subject really, really let the clients down in the moment and gave them responses that were really unhelpful, like lots of platitudes and things coming out. So in a way, it drew our attention to the fact that we don't talk about it. So there isn't a lot of research, and then there isn't then a lot of training, and there isn't a lot of knowledge about this. And furthermore, people are just critically disadvantaged because there's an assumption we all have family that works, and we don't. It's that simple, ultimately.
And one of the things that I care about deeply is not just empathy, but purposeful empathy. So you can design public policies with empathy at the center of a human experience. So I wonder, because for those who might not think about estrangement on a regular basis, what policies are touched when you have an understanding of estrangement? Like, how can we improve public policies to meet needs of people who are experiencing family estrangement?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting policy predicament. And I'm in the final moments of my PhD by paper publication right now. And I think what I'm writing up is this sense that ultimately policymakers don't really understand that family doesn't work. So they will just say, oh, family will provide this. And it could come at moments like, for example, when you apply for a student loan, or when you're expected during the summer break to go home for the holidays, or when you're co-signing a lease, or when you're putting a deposit down for a mortgage for a house. In all of those kinds of public policies, then there's a big assumption that family will support you, will help you. And it's really interesting because ultimately no provision was made other than for people that had been put into the care system, for those that didn't have family support. So they may have these people in their lives, but may not be speaking to them. And then it gives them this kind of, disadvantage because they can't really claim that they are in the care system, but they also can't provide what's needed in terms of policy. So I think that's where people become very stuck, frustrated, isolated. They have this really poor experience of society because nobody understands them. Like they're trying to create and take part in a system that isn't designed for them. And so I think that policymakers should maybe start with the assumption that family doesn't work rather than the assumption that family does work. And that that would give us more of a basis for understanding the kinds of support that people need. And, I'm a realist. I've worked in policy now for quite a long time. I understand that we can't ultimately create policy where we're going to open the floodgates and everybody's going to claim public funds. Like policymakers have that duty to protect public funds. But we also have a safety net, a duty towards a safety net to people that have experienced familial trauma. So the tension, I think, is how we define what an estranged family is and how we define that in policy, but then also looking at how we operationalize that. How do we help young people prove that they don't have that family life? And so much of the work I've done has been to kind of say, look, those processes of how we prove that we don't have family really lack empathy. And they really kind of put that person at this position where they have to prove they're not lying or prove that they're not basically, I suppose trying to cheat the system. And
yeah, because you can see bruises on a body, or you can document certain forms of neglect or abuse, but you might not be able to document living with a narcissist, for example, and what that means from a mental health perspective. Yeah, I can really appreciate that.
No. Well, yeah, and often the struggles of an emotionally abusive household are invisible, and the care system, social services, they don't have the right policies in place to be able to pick up on things like that. Like there isn't an escalation that you would have if there was physical abuse or there was sexual abuse. There's no evidence. So ultimately, it's very hard to get a looked after child order, at least in the UK, for somebody that is experiencing emotional abuse at the hands of a narcissistic parent or a mentally ill parent, because they don't have that kind of sense of how that builds and then the impact on that person. And what young person has the language to explain all that?
Right.
Like, I
And
remember
take it
once,
seriously.
yeah, and be believed. Because so much about emotional abuse, as I'm sure you've talked about a lot, like, is that people don't believe it because it's unevidenceable. But, I think that we have to come from this default, like, kind of place where people are believed that their narrative, people very rarely put forward a false narrative on purpose to try and deceive. It's not something that I've encountered a lot in my professional career, at least.
Something else I read that really struck me was that one of your most profound moments of both personal and professional life was visiting a group of men in a Category C prison. So maybe you'll explain what that means. And that we're part of a prison pilot and a support group for estranged adults. So could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it was, what an amazing moment. It really was like, and the support groups that we'd set up with standalone were very basic, that people would just come together and share across different topics that applied to estrangement. So it could be shame, stigma, Christmas, presents, all the kinds of different topics that come up from a strange individual at these pressure points throughout the year. And we'd done those in 6 places in the UK. We'd set them up, we'd operationalize them. And then some government money became available to put these into prisons. And it's interesting because I think that prison is like this estrangement by default. You're kind of removed from society and you're put in this place that kind of is meant to reform you and help you to become a better person. But nobody was helping these men with the impact of what it was like to be separated from their loved ones, to be separated from their families, and to understand how to kind of repair the relationships and to be able to take part in a meaningful repair process. And, for many of them, of course, I mean, some people had murdered family members. Some people had like really harmed family members as well. So, of course, why would they expect a relationship with people like that? But I think it was kind of interesting that what the groups gave them was this moment to share with each other, be vulnerable, be empathic, that actually in such a hardcore environment, like it's a really hardcore environment, a male prison of whatever category, and Category C is not like a high security prison. It's when people are pretty much going to go out on remand soon. So, these weren't particularly dangerous people. But ultimately, what they all could share is this sense of loss, like this sense of living loss that being in prison gave them. And I guess to kind of, it confounded my beliefs of criminals. It was really interesting, like, because, as a young woman, I think I was like 34, something like that, 33, going into a Category C prison and sitting with a group of people that had been convicted of various crimes, like, was quite intense, really intense experience. But what I felt coming from them really was like this really powerful feeling of like relief, that this had really given them something because it had helped them break down those walls that they had to put up as men in jail. They had to protect themselves in this environment. They had to be hard. But actually, this allowed them a moment to be soft and to actually share their heart and to share the losses that were perhaps also, I suppose, informing some of their pain and some of their drive towards feeling shame and not fitting in society. But what's important about this really crucially is that when we look at the prison system and when people graduate from the prison system, then they need those family members because they are going to need to go back to a life of some kind. And that's family capital right there. the people that will take them in after they come out of jail, the people that will prevent them from falling into homelessness, preventing them from reoffending, and taking them away from communities where perhaps they would be more likely to reoffend. And it is really fascinating. I think, it's a very easy example. If you don't have that, you're much more likely to be back in jail.
Yeah, so I wonder, maybe now's the time. I knew I was going to ask the question. I have a 9-year-old now. We have a great relationship, but I imagine that when she enters her tween and teen years, I know what I was like as a teenage girl. Maybe there are other parents listening. I wonder, based on all the conversations you've had and the research that you've conducted, are there important takeaways that you think you can share with parents in terms of how they think about their parenting so that they don't experience that estrangement?
Yeah, like preventative measures. Goodness, I sit with so many estranged parents in my therapy practice now, and lots of different families that have fallen apart. And the one thing that I think I could absolutely say that all of them share is that they didn't listen to their children.
Mm.
They didn't take the time or take them seriously when they did take the time. So if you can seriously listen to someone's complaint, really find the kernel of truth in it and know that it's true for them, I think that's where you can actually do really valid work in terms of creating emotional intimacy. It's like, how do we hear each other? How do we really understand each other's separate experience? And I know as parents, what we want to say is that you're having a great time. I'm doing a great job. Like you're lucky. You've got a roof over your head. You've got, money you've got money in the bank. You've got food on the table. You've got all these aspects of family capital, which are really important. However, if you don't have that emotional connection, that emotional intimacy, trust that you can bring anything to that parent and it will be okay, then, how can you show love? How can you build on that? So I feel that for a lot of what I'm probably trying to say in summary is that for a lot of the people I've worked with, love feels conditional on them being a certain way, doing a certain thing, and acting in a certain fashion. And it all breaks down if someone can't really be heard in their own individual experience of life and be, I suppose, loved in that and understood in that and
It
given the
sounds
benefit of the doubt.
right, and it sounds like, parents who do love their children might struggle because they don't have the tools or they weren't parented that way or they have their own issues and traumas that they're dealing with. So I want to complicate this matter a little bit further because I had a conversation not too long ago with a woman who has an adult child and experienced a breakup letter, and she was devastated. She said that 2 or 3 weeks later, she read about in the New York Times this growing phenomenon of young people basically breaking up with their parents. And the newspaper article was actually saying that this was a movement on TikTok and that there was actually some social engineering from the Chinese government, like why not break America apart from like imploding it from within, that this was like a strategy designed to, create civil unrest. So I'm just curious to know, how do you unpack and it feels like, is it possible that there's a continuum between abuse and neglect and where children who become sort of growing into their adulthood recognize that actually what's happening in my home is not healthy for me and I'm prepared to distance myself, and the complicated realities of parents who are doing their best, who are also trying to manage relationships in the teenage years that are difficult and that children might be jumping onto this, bandwagon. So I just wonder if you have thoughts to say about that.
Yeah, I think people love to blame a third party, and it's the first time that I've heard China as the third party. So that's a new one for me. I'm glad you brought it up. But I think that ultimately, it takes more than a hashtag to break a family relationship. Like, if family relationships are that fragile, that hashtag can help someone encourage them to move away from it. There was something deeply broken in the dynamic in that in the first place. So I don't feel that young people are ever that flippant about it. And mainly because it's such a disadvantaging thing to do. It's not like you're going to buy yourself a huge advantage in life by doing this. Like, you're going to put yourself up against a lot of material and financial deprivation, and you're going to basically plunge yourself into poverty. So, like, why would you do that on a hashtag to fit in with your friends on social media? It just doesn't make much sense in terms of the real world impact of that. And I've spoken about this time and time again, that when we don't want to look at ourselves and when we don't want to look at parts of ourselves that perhaps we're not so proud of, that may have hurt people, we often kind of want to dismiss that perspective and blame something else as a deflection. Deflection is a powerful tool. And what we can do is we can blame therapists. I've heard so many people say that therapists are to blame, that they're telling children, they're telling young adults to, cut off contact with their parents. I don't believe for a moment that that's true. I think that ultimately, yes, there's obviously one or two malpracticing therapists here and there that may give direct advice, but what they're helping people find in themselves is the truth for themselves in that relationship. And if that relationship lacks empathy, if it lacks any kind of depth, if it lacks emotional care, holding, trust, then that relationship can fall apart easily because it's been emotionally estranged from the beginning. And this is what we find with estrangement, is that there's often like a kind of emotional deprivation to it first, and then we break physical contact. So I think that I do understand why the media like to sensationalize this and put all these theories out there, but there is zero in research to qualify that. Like, I just want to say, not factual, all conjecture. And I think we have to be quite careful, because what we're not looking at is what is the actual problem in the dynamics coming up. And the problem in the dynamic is really generational, I would say. Sociologically, people in past generations, baby boomer generations, they just really believed in duty when it came to family. They believed in family ties that were ever long lasting, and whatever behavior someone brought to it, it didn't matter whether it was healthy or not. It didn't matter whether it harmed someone or not. They were your family and you stood by them. Your own personal being was not a factor. Your needs were not a factor. It was just the fact that you had to keep a relationship. And that's what the baby boomer generation grew up believing. And as a consequence, they took some very harmful behavior. So, they grew up being physically punished for many things. They grew up being ostracized. They grew up being basically shamed, because that's what parenting was seen to be doing in that age. Whereas now we've got a ton of psychological research and sociological research to say, actually, those behaviors are really harmful for people, that we're going to create mental health difficulties, that we're going to create really, really, big struggles for people if we physically punish them. And now in countries like Scotland, Canada, it's outlawed, right? You can't do that. Like, there's a law against it. And so I think what we're seeing is the younger generation holding on to this evidence base of like, look, it's not healthy to gaslight me. It's not healthy to kind of say that it's my problem. It's not healthy to say that I shouldn't have feelings or sweep things under the carpet, not talk about things. Like, big things can happen, we just don't talk about it. Like, that approach just doesn't wash with a generation that have ultimately grown up knowing that relationships, family relationships and marital relationships can break. They're not unconditional anymore. Does that make sense? I know I may have gone on a meander there.
Tons of sense. I mean, it's just no, I'm imagining how important your work is now for parents who have experienced estrangement, who might have felt that they were well-intentioned parents doing right by their kids, to grapple with what they need to own as their child is standing up with a sense of agency around what their limits and boundaries are. So, I read also, when you stepped down from Standalone, this organization that you founded, you wrote, I have come to the point where I feel I want to spend less of my life talking about my family wounds in high profile spaces, After a decade, I feel it's time to move on to a different phase of my life and allow new energized voices and perspectives to take the spotlight. I feel this is part of healing, and I'm sharing this for anyone who may feel that the pain of family estrangement is endless. It does take work, but moving on to a different place is possible. So I love that. I want to give you space to share sort of like, how you came to make this transition and the work that you're doing now. I'd really like to hear about what you're doing now.
And yet here I am on a podcast still talking about like my family wounds and talking about this subject. So it's somewhat hard to get away from, right? Yeah, I do think that there comes a point in your life where I was working incredibly hard, like very, very long weeks and having a lot of responsibility and running a nonprofit. And I often also felt that my voice dominated because I did found the organization. I was always called on for media. And I was like, hang on a minute, like, isn't it time to let other voices speak? Like, it's not just me that goes through this, like, and rehashing my story every 10 minutes isn't that helpful because people have read it. So let's try now and find some other people that want to step up and talk. And gratefully, there are lots of those people around. But yeah, I do think there's a moment where like you can begin to not focus so hard on it because you have done a lot of the work and you've kind of faced a lot of the pain. And in therapy, you've kind of realized, well, why am I attracted to that pattern? Like what did that give me that I now need to go off and change and kind of energetically reshift and reframe? And I think for me, I had a really big reframe, like around all of it. Like this is going to sound very interesting, like kind of not many professionals talk about it, but I did a lot of embodiment work, like a huge amount. Like I did a lot of dancing, like ecstatic dance. I did a lot of yoga. I basically plunged right into my body and healed a lot of the trauma that was in my body. And after I did that, and after I shifted a lot of that, I felt that the really like strong kind of tigress of a voice that I had kind of lost some of its power in a way because it wasn't feeling so angry. Like the anger had gone and it got to a softer point of like sadness and acceptance. And in a way, I kind of felt, wow, like, the fire to run an organization, to change public policy, to work relentlessly, to like really feel that we had to transform society, like kind of just ended. And I began to accept the world as it was, accept my world as it was, and think, wow, like that's just the best healing. Can I just accept it all? And doesn't mean I have to have a relationship with people, or it doesn't mean that I have to change how I feel about my family, but I can accept what happened and I can accept the world is flawed. Like, there's a great phrase in recovery called life on life's terms. And I was like, life on life's terms, like shit happens. Family life is like this. Let's accept it and not try and fight it so much and try and change the world in my image.
It's interesting that you talked about this embodied work. I invited a somatic therapist to speak to my class this semester, and she was sharing that the original somatic experiencing theory came from watching animals, that like if animals go through a very frightening or traumatic experience, they'll have a way of shaking it off or giving a big roar or some physical release. And I think I'm just at the beginning of exploring how much gets locked into our bodies. And I think the research is catching up to maybe what some of the folks who are ahead of the curve have figured out, that we hold so much in our bodies. And if we can find ways to release it, that there's a huge healing that can come from that.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I do think that, The Body Keeps the Score, I think is one of the most important books ever written. I think it helps us understand that automatically, perhaps we go for the mind when it comes to healing. But now I just think, no, I just need to go for the body. I just need to go for the body and I need to go for that place, like where ultimately, like I can understand somatically that I'm going to be able to process that trauma more quickly if I go for what's the feeling in my body, like what is the feeling here. Ultimately, if I get angry about something, I go for a walk or I dance for 10 minutes and I feel very differently than if I kind of talk to a friend endlessly about it. I mean, talking is really helpful to recharacterize something and to kind of reframe it, or to kind of create a really helpful narrative that you can then go on and form an identity around. I'm a therapist. I really agree with talking, but I do think, when we go for the body, we can create a much more, I think, kind of well-rounded healing. Like we can become more whole more quickly.
Mm.
And what's really fascinating, if everyone goes on the internet and looks at me 12 years ago when I founded Standalone and looks at me now, I look incredibly different. And I think that is like because ultimately, energetically, I moved a lot of the trauma. I moved a lot of like what was, really holding me back.
Thank you for sharing that. You've also written a book called Running, which is a coming of age novel,
Okay.
right? You want to share a few words about the book?
Well, no one ever talks to me about this. This is novel to talk about. Yeah. Well, of course, like, other forms of healing, writing is so important. And I feel that like, I've obviously written for a living for a very long time. Like my words and my are very powerful for people, and feel so grateful that I can channel that from wherever I'm channeling it from, and that I can create that and put that out there into human consciousness. And the novel, goodness me, like saved my life so many times, because whenever there was something painful that I was coming up against with my family situation, I just wrote about it. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and like I created meaning from it by creating joy from it, like laughing at it, by like creating humor and prose that described my feelings. And there's something so powerful about having a feeling and describing it that I just love. Like there's nothing more awakening for me than finding the right metaphor or the right simile and being able to communicate something in a way that wakes people up. Like that, goodness, there's nothing more thrilling about the human experience than that for me. It's powerful. So the book was a labor of love, and it's, I self-published it because an old boyfriend told me that I really should after he read it. So I think that, it wasn't necessarily a professional decision. It was more of a like, I spent nearly 10 years on this thing. I should put it out there.
Well,
Yeah.
we'll include information in the show notes.
You can, yeah, goodness. Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because it occurs to me now that in whatever format, if it's research papers, if it's journalism, if it's creative writing, I have always turned to words to heal. And that is, that's why it's so important, I think, like to have these tools to express ourselves and to be heard.
Well, that's an interesting segue to the penultimate question. This is, after all, a podcast devoted to empathy, and the series is to expand our empathy for groups that are often misunderstood or feel marginalized in some way. So, what ways do you believe regular people, can show more empathy and understanding in everyday conversations? How can we speak to people? How can we listen to people who are experiencing estrangement from a more empathic place?
I think first of all, it's about taking away that question, oh, well, when are you going to reconcile with them? I think it's like this automatic kind of default to, oh, well, reconciliation's the best thing. When actually, for so many people, it isn't. Like for so many people, they have to leave behind these relationships because the other side of it isn't there to grow in the dynamic. And the dynamic's going to be very one-sided. People just don't want to wake up. They don't want to bring themselves to a change process. So it can't move forward. So I think, of course, that's very hard to understand. Why wouldn't you just accept it as it is? But if somebody's telling you that their family relationship is genuinely harmful, I think it's rather than question it or interrogate it, to accept it and say, yes, I understand that. Like, I can empathize. I've understood when I've had painful relationships, or to reach into that vault of human experience where we've been hurt by someone and they haven't wanted to change. They've kept hurting us. We've probably all had that, I would say, in one form or another, in a relationship or in, a friendship or even a work colleague relationship. Then, we've had people that just persistently can't see themselves and won't change. and won't consider your point of view or care about whether their activities hurt you.
Mm.
So I think in one way or another, we've probably all got that empathy point there that we can say we understand what it's like to be continually hurt. And, you know, what everybody would say about marriage, about a job, about friendship is, well, maybe you shouldn't be in that. But interestingly, with family relationships, we just don't have that social permission slip. And I would say people could respond by giving people that social permission slip, by saying, I understand families are not always easy. I understand families can be very harmful sometimes.
So is your current work in coaching families and therapy working with the children who have made decisions for estrangement, or both sides of the equation?
Yeah, mainly actually the parents. I do way more work with the parents because they often search me out to try and find that empathy, to try and find why their child would think that way. Like what are they thinking? I often get the what are they thinking question. And of course, I don't know what they're thinking on that first kind of moment that I meet the client. But what I do understand is that I think that often the children are thinking they're not safe. I think the major thread that runs through all relationships that break down is that someone doesn't feel safe. And that I think is, you know, that's where, yeah, I suppose the parents can learn how to create safety. And that's often by simply holding a conversation without telling someone they're wrong, or without saying your perception is incorrect, or you don't remember it well, or you're mad to think that way, you've got problems. You know, all the things we could do to deflect from really hearing their truth.
Well, that circles back to the earlier comment that you made about just listening, right? That's such an important part of what parents need to do, is to listen and believe what their kid is saying, and to listen with their heart and be ready to see them as fully, you know, endowed human beings, separate from themselves, not extensions of themselves. Right? Yeah.
And also with a separate experience of their family life. Someone could have thought their family life was great, and that's fine, that's your experience. But can we be open to thinking, well, maybe someone experienced it very differently? We honor that and kind of say, yeah, everyone's entitled to their separate experiences of family life. It's not just about one narrative that someone decides is right. It's about all of us having our own perspective and all those being valid.
Beautiful. My last question will be if you can think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy, and what that meant for you, Becca.
Well, like, you know, I actually am going to use quite a recent example. Like, I think maybe, yeah, I had a really interesting moment where I realized that I was kind of hiding something from someone. Like I was like not telling the whole truth, let's say, because I was fearful that if they found out that I would feel a lot of shame, that they would judge me. So right back to my Guardian article, like, you know, still the same pattern, like, you know, but obviously this was way more about something very personal about my age. And yeah, they found out somehow that basically that I'd been hiding a little part of this. And you know what? Like in the moment, they were like so empathic. They were like, I totally understand. You know, I'm getting older as well. It's like really, really hard sometimes to like feel the age that we are, and to be really honest about that, and to kind of stand in that without any kind of shame. Because like, you know, I don't have children, I'm not married, you know, so I've done things really differently. Like I really prioritize my career. I've done everything that my grandma as a woman couldn't do, which is get education, travel, and work really hard and get high powered in terms of my career, you know. And so I kind of felt I was trying to do things for her. But in that process, I didn't really think about how the time goes fast. And then suddenly you're just about over 40 and thinking, oh, it's time to have kids now. And I felt a lot of shame around that I hadn't really caught up in that picture. And but that person really held me in that moment and was like so understanding and so empathic, and really saw past the fact that I was, really saw past any kind of idea that I was trying to be purposefully deceptive and just actually saw the struggle. Saw the, let's say, I suppose like the vulnerability.
And I love asking that question. I never know what story I'm going to hear, but it's always, always, always a reminder that empathy is our superpower. It's such a powerful gift that we have. And if we extend empathy to others, it has such a big impact on people's lives. So why wouldn't we do more of it? Becca,
No, we really do, don't we? I think that's how the world would work a lot better, is if we all showed a lot more empathy. So yeah, I think that, but I think it starts with thinking like what is close to me in my human experience with these people. Like, have I repeatedly been in a harmful relationship? Can I empathize from that point?
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you for spending the hour with me on the show, especially since I was late to the interview. Again, I want to say thank you for that.
I have empathy for that. So I've been late, I've been late for things before, so I understand it's, it happens, doesn't it?
There you go. Well, thank you for everyone who has been watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
If you know someone who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them now. Post the link to your socials and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have an important role to play.